Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and as promised, I have a true crime story for you today. Last week, we wrapped up the history of Seacliff Mental Hospital, but today I have the story of a patient who resided there for almost 40 years. Trigger warnings in this episode include discussion of murder, but also white supremacy and racism, particularly toward folks of Asian descent. There is a lot of material written by the perpetrator himself, some of which I will read, but I'm choosing to omit his material that was overtly racist and could be considered part of his manifesto. I don't need to give him a platform for those thoughts. For this episode, I will be relying heavily on the book, The History of Seacliff by Frank Tod. Big thank you again to Sue M. for helping me access this book. I could not have done this episode without you, so thank you so much. All other sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. Speaking of the book by Frank Tod, there are some discrepancies in dates given in that book compared to other sources I found. Tod states that he spoke directly to our perpetrator, who is a psychopath, for some of the information. So it's entirely possible that some of it could be directly misleading. So just please be aware of that. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Seacliff Mental Hospital. Edward Lionel Terry, who went by his middle name Lionel, was born on January 6th, 1873. And just as a side note for our U.S. listeners, I think Lionel Terry would have appreciated the significance of being born on January 6th. Anyway, he was born in Kent, England, the son of Edward Terry and his wife Frances Lydia Thompson. His father was said to have descended from a noble French family, de Thierry, who arrived in Kent during the French Revolution. Apparently, they were descended from Napoleon Bonaparte, and Lionel's father saw this in his son. He would later be quoted as saying, quote, and I can only say this with a really bad British accent, so I'm sorry, Sir Herbert Jerningham. I just can't say it any other way. Sir Herbert Jerningham. Sir Herbert Jerningham was among those who have remarked upon my likeness to Napoleon, and now the inflexible will of the conqueror of Europe is being reproduced in my son. I never knew him to turn aside from any course he started upon. Popular as he was, no one could bend or break his will. He would have his own way. End quote. There's a wee bit of foreshadowing in that quote. So Lionel was one of 11 children. According to Frank Tod, at an early age, Lionel Terry was sent to school at Merton College in Wimbledon, where he was known as a boy who could do anything. He was particularly known for his artwork and writings, but he studied business methods with the intent of joining his father in working for an estate agency in Pall Mall. But Terry wasn't one to settle. He had bigger hopes and dreams for himself. At age 21, without his father's knowledge, he enlisted in a line regiment. There, his artistic skills made him popular, even though he broke the rules by covering the walls of the Windsor barracks rooms with drawings. Frank Tod writes that the chaplain of the regiment was so pleased with the caricature of himself that he cut out the plaster it was drawn on and had it framed. A year after joining the regiment, he transferred to the Royal Horse Guards. After 2 years, his father bought his discharge and brought him back to London to partner with him in business. But Terry wasn't having any of it. I can't stay in London, Father, he said. I can't breathe here. He left for South Africa and joined the mounted police at Bulawayo and served in the Matabele War. And this is where we get into historical events that Sarah was never taught about territory. So I had to look up this war. According to Wikipedia, the First Matabele War occurred between 1893 and 1894 in modern-day Zimbabwe. It included the British South Africa Company fighting against the Matabele Kingdom. Cecil Rhodes, who was the leader of the British South Africa Company and Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, took quite a likening to Lionel Terry and thought very highly of him. as a side note, you may recognize Cecil Rhodes from the prestigious Rhodes Scholarship, which is named after him. So, kind of a big deal. While he was fighting in South Africa, Terry took part in the botched Jameson raid from December 29th, 1895 to January 2nd, 1896. Of the 500 British police involved in the raid, of which Terry was one, 18 were killed and 40 were wounded. It was here in South Africa that Terry worked alongside Chinese immigrants for the first time. The experience, according to the Tayara website, engendered a deep hatred of, quote, black and colored races, but especially of Chinese folks. Before long, his hatred became an obsession. After this, Lionel Terry returned to London for 2 years, but once again he felt confined by the city. He left first for Germany and then sailed for Dominica. According to Frank Tod, he spent weeks exploring an almost unknown interior. Quote, he then presented the island with a large map of the unknown region and was offered a medal as an acknowledgement of official thanks. I am not collecting such silly baubles at present, he wrote to his father, end quote. Now, something's off in this story to me. I mean, you mean to tell me that the people who lived on the island of Dominica had no idea about the geographics of the island where they'd lived their entire lives? But then in comes this British dude who comes over, goes on a hike, draws up a map, and they're saved? I don't think so. My guess is he did all that because the interior wasn't known to other British folks, but I'm almost certain it was known by locals. He probably got excited to give them the map, probably said, "And you're welcome." To which the locals said, "Yeah, thanks. You want the sand dollar?" So that's Sarah's interpretation of history, so take that as you will. Afterward, Terry went to New York, Honolulu, and British Columbia. In Canada, he became the secretary of the Miners' Protection Union and in 1900 sent a nasty letter to a local newspaper that clearly conveyed his hatred of Chinese workers and blamed them for white people not getting jobs. He went back to London after this, said goodbye to his parents, and left for New Zealand in 1901. Frank Tod says, quote, he spent months in walking, tramping across the country in the attempt to study the political and economic situation and earning his living by mining, farming, and prospecting for gold, end quote. He was hired by the Lands and Survey Department and took a walking tour of the North Island of New Zealand. His intent, according to Frank Tod, was to journey to the South Island, then to the United States, and back to England. At nights, Tod says, he would camp under a tree or sometimes alongside a rock for shelter. He carried a sleeping bag and ample food provisions. Throughout his long walking feat, Terry attracted much publicity by lecturing in almost every town along the way, traveling via Auckland, Waikato, Rotorua, Taupo, Napier, and Wairarapa. His distance of almost 900 miles was covered in 40 days, or an average of 22 miles a day. He kept a diary of his movements during his travels throughout the North Island, end quote. I should add here that while he's traveling, he's lecturing on the, quote, iniquity of the yellow agony, and he's quite proud of his very racist ideas. In fact, he ended up publishing a book called God is Gold, which expressed his fear that, quote, the prospects of New Zealand were being undermined by the advent of the Chinaman, end quote. I don't know how to tell this guy that Chinese immigrants had been in New Zealand since before he was even born. And also, he is an immigrant himself and a newcomer to New Zealand at that. But I don't think colonizers had that mentality. Now, I haven't mentioned it up to this point, but almost every source I read talks about how tall and handsome Lionel Terry was. Some sources say he may have been as tall as 6'3". So people were drawn to him because he was good-looking, smooth-talking, and full of knowledge. All things considered, he was well-liked. His hatred of Chinese immigrants seemed to take over his mind, though. Frank Tod says, quote, "He never lost an opportunity of preaching it to all he met. He beguiled his resting moments on his long tramp through the North Island by impressing the iniquity of the yellow agony upon all and sundry. And after his arrival in Wellington, he had several conversations on the subject with the Premier of the country, Richard Seddon, and other members of Parliament, including the Commissioner of Customs. The latter asked Terry when he intended to go south, and he replied that he wished to first ascertain what the government intended to do in regard to the question of legislation against Chinese immigration. The commissioner informed him that there was not much likelihood of anything being done in the matter during the present session. Terry regarded this answer as very disappointing, as he appeared to have been bent on getting a favorable reply before leaving Wellington." End quote. I should add that Terry went to visit these officials on September 14th, 1905. Terry knew he had to get his ideas out to the public, so he decided to write a pamphlet called The Shadow as a way of informing others. Tod notes, quote, "The shadow had on its colorful a powerfully drawn representation of a demon representing the yellow man, which was menacing with a sword the white races, represented by a dome. The Shadow was a long poem expressing Terry's views on the so-called Yellow Peril. The time is AD 2000, and the poem imagines Great Britain under the dominion of aliens, read Chinese folks, and her plight is contrasted with her former glory," end quote. And no, I will not be reading any of that poem because the description alone of it is disgusting. But suffice it to say that the pamphlet is violent in nature about driving out immigrants. And I bring this up to show the extent to which Lionel Terry's hatred of Chinese immigrants has consumed his life. He can't even do his job without thinking of it, and he's convinced that his writing will make him famous. But The Shadow doesn't sell as much as he expected it to, and Terry is once again extremely disappointed. Fine, he must have thought. I'll find another way to make people notice. They'll see that they should take me seriously. On September 24th, 1905, only 10 days after he'd visited with government officials, Lionel Terry was angry and on a mission. He entered the Wellington Chinatown on Haining Street and saw an older Chinese man walking with a limp. Terry went up behind him, raised his pistol, and shot the man in the head. Terry then holstered his gun and walked away, heading to dinner. The man was later identified as 68-year-old Joe Kum Young, and he was rushed to the hospital but died soon after. One of the unfortunate parts of this story is that not much is known about the victim of this case. We know that Joe Kum Young was born in 1837 in Punyu County, Canton. In 1876, Young immigrated to Victoria, Australia to mine for gold. He would have been a little late to the game at that time, so he didn't stay long. In 1880, he left for New Zealand to mine in the Otago gold rush. While working in the mines, he broke his leg, leaving him unable to work and with a permanent limp. During his hospitalization, the Chinese community raised enough funds for him to be able to return to China, but Young decided to stay in New Zealand. He went to Wellington, where he was living on the streets. And then, on September 24th, 1905, his path crossed with Lionel Terry, with fatal results. Another sad part to me about that story is that Young had the opportunity to go back home, but he chose to stay. Still, even if he had gone back to China, Terry would have found somebody else. He hadn't targeted Young specifically. He was looking for any person of Chinese descent to make his point. And Joe Kum Young was in the wrong place at the wrong time. After the murder, Terry sent a letter to the governor. To the governor of New Zealand, Sir, having spent several years in various parts of the British Empire inquiring into the subjects of the results arising from alien immigration and being convinced of the evil consequence arising therefrom, I have decided to bring the matter before the public eye in a manner which will compel the attention it demands. I will not, under any circumstances whatever, allow my rights and those of my fellow Britons to be jeopardized by alien invaders, and to make this decision perfectly plain, I have this evening evening put a Chinaman to death in the Chinese quarters of the city known as Haining Street. I am, etc., Lionel Terry, British subject." End quote. I like the line, "I am, etc." I can think of a few things he is, one of which is audacious. The audacity of taking matters into his own hands to prove a point. I have put someone to death, as if he's making himself the judge, jury, and executioner, as if it's justified. But in his mind, it was justified. Frank Tod describes the aftermath of the murder. Quote, "The police were completely baffled. They knew no cause of animosity against the deceased. The only evidence they received was that of a Chinaman who gave very little information as to the description of the murderer. The investigating police inspector remarked, 'The evidence is slight, and search for the murderer may be long.' It so happened, however, that the search for the murderer was indeed very short. For the morning following the crime, the governor received his letter, and at the same time, a handsome young man calmly strolled into the Wellington police station and told the following story. 'I have come to tell you that I am the man who shot the Chinaman in the Chinese quarters of the city last evening. I take an interest in alien immigration, and I took this means of bringing it under public notice.' At first, the police thought that he was playing a kind of joke on them, for it was very hard for them to believe that the murderer could be such a person, who was described by one of the police inspectors, quote, 'a perfect picture, as fine a man as I ever saw, bold upright, and with as free an action as you'd ever see on an athlete,' end quote. But when this remarkable figure handed to the police a pamphlet, which he said would explain things, and produced a revolver with 2 chambers discharged, they were convinced that this was the very man was the culprit of the tragic occurrence in Haining Street the previous evening. The police wrote out the statement, and the self-accused man willingly signed it, Lionel Terry. Terry was charged with murder and placed under arrest." End quote. Now, what's interesting to me about this is A, how much time they focus on the alleged attractiveness of this guy, and B, how even today we still have this idea that criminals are supposed to look a certain way. The police couldn't believe that someone who looked like Lionel Terry could have committed murder. And how many times have we said that today about people who've committed crimes? He didn't seem like the type. I would have never suspected her. Now, in a move that is indicative of a narcissist, Terry decided to represent himself in court. Always a good idea. Highly recommend. Yeah. Frank Tod describes how this went in court. Quote, "The registrar read the indictment and at its conclusion asked the usual question, guilty or not guilty? Terry, I object to the word guilty. His Honor, then what do you say? Terry, nothing, except that my offense is right and justifiable. His Honor, very well, I shall enter a plea of not guilty." Terry made a long statement from the dock, and after commenting on the number of aliens called as witnesses in the case, Terry then strongly resented the suggestion made by the coroner that he was insane. He said this and other rumors of sunstroke were false. He then expatiated on the meritorious action he had conferred upon mankind. He stated, "My action was the result of careful deliberation, and I was impelled by merciful consideration for all concerned. In choosing as an example an old and crippled man, I realized that my purpose would be accomplished without the sacrifice of one whose existence was none other but a painful burden. By thus quenching a flame which was already flickering toward extinction, I have not only conferred a merciful deliverance upon a world-weary man, but have also benefited the country in which he has come to live by an act designed to arouse its people from a state of callous indifference." End quote. Ugh. He genuinely believed that he did not kill another human being, but merely took care of an inconvenience. This language is so calloused and problematic. So it comes as no surprise that Terry was found guilty and sentenced to death. But the sentence raised some concerns. Some people believe that Terry was not deserving of death because he was, quote, suffering from a craze caused by his intense hatred towards the mixing of British and alien races, end quote. And this allowed his sentence to be commuted from death to life imprisonment. But Lionel Terry would come to be known as a difficult inmate and a menace. He was sent to Littleton jail but didn't approve of his quarters, so he set the jail on fire. Because that's what you do when you're dissatisfied with your jail conditions, apparently. At some point, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and sent to Sunnyside Mental Hospital. Remember that the criteria for schizophrenia at the turn of the 20th century wasn't like our criteria for schizophrenia today. It was more geared toward mood disorders like depression. I would argue, too, that Terry shows evidence of antisocial and narcissistic personality traits. So they may have classified him as having schizophrenia because they didn't have personality disorder classifications yet. A year after the murder of Joachim Young, Lionel Terry escaped from Sunnyside Hospital. He was at large for 4 days. While he was out, he wrote this letter, essentially taunting the people looking for him. God's own country, the 24th of September, 1906. Greetings. I am writing you this in hopes that its insertion in your invaluable paper may allay any anxiety my friends may be experiencing regarding my welfare. I enclose copies of correspondence between the government and myself to date regarding my mission. You will observe that after waiting a year in jails and madhouses, I am no forader. Side note, I had to look up what no forader meant. It's basically, I'm no further along than I had been. There you go. I think I have quite vindicated my claim to the possession of patience and am going to enjoy the larger life pending developments. I am in excellent health, and I'm having a right royal time among mountains and forests. Had a dip in the river yesterday. The water is, however, a little too cold at present, and I had to indulge in a good run uphill in order to get what the silly medicos called the red blood corpuscles smiling again. I have no settled plans for the future. I think I told you once that I never make plans. My movements will depend upon circumstances, climatic and otherwise. I may stroll down as far as Cromwell and Alexandria, which I believe are rather interesting places. My favorite mode of traveling is cross-country. It is much more natural and interesting than going by beaten tracks. If you poor slaves in the city only knew the way to live, and could join me in this sweet sequestered nook enchanted by bird music and laughter of cascading living crystal, quite poetic, eh? Well, I am very sorry for you. With kind wishes for all my friends, I am, etc., Lionel Terry. End quote. Again, the absolute audacity of this man to brag about what he was doing after his escape. He really believes that his imprisonment was an injustice. He was caught, however, and returned to the Littleton jail. By December of 1906, there were plans to set aside one section of the jail as a lunatic asylum built just for Terry, but those plans were canceled. Instead, he was transferred back to Sunnyside, where he immediately made another escape. Frank Tod points out what hospital administrators must have wondered at the time. Quote, what was to be done with Lionel Terry? Twice, within a short period of time, he had escaped from the Sunnyside Mental Hospital. Powerful, cool, determined, and animated by a strong instinct for liberty, a man not certainly of the criminal type, a prisoner whom bolts and bars could not restrain, how is the community to deal with him? Having been declared insane, there was difficulty in having him sent back to prison. He was not a violent mental patient for whom in those days straitjackets and padded room could be rightly prescribed. Yet it was hard to see how the authorities were going to solve the problem of maintaining the public sense of security and respect for the law without injustice being done to the prisoner. End quote. Now, this is a good point. We know that history is the best predictor of future violence. Terry still has his maniacal and xenophobic beliefs about folks of Asian descent, but he also isn't imminently dangerous. We have the same problem at hospitals today. Just because somebody might harm someone else doesn't mean they will. If, however, the person is showing precursor behavior that is indicative of them before an assault, that becomes a different story. So all that to say that even though Terry is a dangerous man, he isn't making threats to harm other people, nor is he violent or aggressive when he's caught. So there's no imminent need to restrain him, but he keeps escaping. During this time, there were many people in the community who agreed with Terry's ideas about immigrants. He was certainly not an outlier in those beliefs. In fact, 50,000 community members made a petition to the governor for the release of Lionel Terry. Members of the Chinese community quickly assembled to produce a counter petition. It was his supporting members in the community who also saw him as a national hero. Some even vowed to try to sneak him out of the country. He was not alone in his endeavors. Each escape attempt got him closer to freedom. Some of his supporters even believed that, quote, Terry's enclosure with the mentally diseased would wreck his reason, and they called for renewed attention to be given to the classification of inmates of mental hospitals, end quote. They really saw him as a victim of the system. In November 1907, Terry was transferred to Seacliff Asylum. He was only there for a few days before he escaped, and Frank Tod describes it as follows. Quote, apparently he was in the library with 2 attendants, but then he went into an adjoining scullery and thence into an ex-patient's room. One of the window stops had been taken out of the room. It was surmised that Terry, having known this, took advantage of an opportunity to make an escape by means of the window. Search parties were sent out at once and remained in the neighborhood throughout the night. Another search party left the hospital the following morning. The whole police force in the country was on the lookout. Sergeant Emerson, Constables Pont, Skinner, and Bayard from Dunedin proceeded to Waitati, and from there they sent out to scour the surrounding country. The missing patient had been traced by another party of police only a few miles beyond Hindon. Terry had been seen by residents in that district and remarked to him that he was out for a walk. 2 weeks went by before police finally caught up to Terry. They were about 18 miles inland of Waikuaiti when they saw him. Detective Hunt said, "Hello, Terry." And Terry said, "Good afternoon. I know that you are policemen." He then walked coolly towards Goat Rock Gully. Hunt and Kidd immediately gave chase, but Terry led them fast down the face of a hill toward the bush. Hunt fell among the rocks, sustaining a bad cut above the temple, which stunned him, and a broken thumb, and Terry disappeared into the bush. After another 3 days' liberty, Terry was finally captured, end quote. I should add that he was captured after another chase and rolling down a hill, but fortunately there were no injuries that time. But the guy put up a fight, that's for sure. He walked back to Waikuaiti saying, "It might be some time before I get out for a walk again." And from there, he was taken back to Seacliff. Dr. Truby King met Terry at the Seacliff train station and talked to him for a couple of minutes before instructing that his handcuffs be removed. Constable Pont reminded him that Terry had just escaped and he couldn't remove the handcuffs until he had receipt for delivery of his patient. Dr. King asked again for the handcuffs to be removed, and they were. Terry walked with Dr. King up the hill toward the hospital, and as they walked, Terry told the story of his escape. Dr. King, Tod writes, offered Terry considerable freedom on the condition that he would not attempt to escape again. And to this I say, Truby King, dude, I can see what you're trying to do, but that type of trust is earned, and Terry has not earned it. Fortunately, I guess, Terry didn't agree to Dr. King's terms, so he was placed once again under lock and key. Only a few months later, Terry escaped again, this time from a rope hanging in the window of the recreation hall. And once again, Tod describes the creative means of escape. Quote, Terry, with 2 attendants, was painting among the scenery canvases used for the stage. The window being narrow and directly above the main entrance, and the room being on the third story, his attendants deemed escape impossible and were in no way concerned when Terry passed behind a scene and apparently remained there, as his white shoes could be seen beneath the canvas. Soon someone rushed up to the recreation hall saying that they had seen Terry dashing through the gardens and up the hill toward the cow buyers. "No fear, you didn't," replied one of the two attendants. "He's painting behind the scenes." Then another came up to announce that he had seen Terry entering the bush. A rush was made for the canvas barrier, and there were the white shoes, but to their amazement, no Terry. They discovered the window open and a length of rope about 15 feet. A side note to say that they were 3 stories up, so a 15-foot long rope still means he had quite a ways left to fall. Preparations for the recapture were effected with the greatest dispatch. Attendants were sent out in every likely direction. The police were informed by telephone, and soon constables from neighboring stations were converging towards Seacliff. An attendant in vaulting a fence near the Simla bush alighted almost on top of Terry, who was hiding on the outer edge of the scrub. Another attendant appeared from the other side. Terry was caught. But even then, had he thought fit to use physical force, Terry, in splendid fettle, could have probably made good his escape. But he merely lay there and protested and refused to move. The attendants secured his wrists and ankles with their pocket handkerchiefs and carried him every inch of the way back to the hospital. End quote. When he returned to the hospital, Terry was placed on 2-to-1 observation outside his locked door. He and his attendants had a yard all to themselves where Terry would run back and forth as if preparing for his next escape. You can imagine the burden that this was for a hospital that was already overcrowded and understaffed. We have the same problem today at state hospitals. If someone has to be placed on enhanced observation with a staff monitoring them, we need to get an extra staff member so that we don't lose one from their regular duties. In the community, all anyone could talk about was Lionel Terry this and Lionel Terry that. He was a bigger conversation than the weather. In March 1908, not long after his most recent escape, Terry was moved back to Littleton Jail. He didn't stay there long, though, before he was transferred to Sunnyside Hospital. He remained there for 2 or 3 years before he requested to be moved back to Seacliff. Once again, Dr. Truby King offered extended freedom on the condition that he wouldn't attempt to escape. This time, Terry agreed, and he kept that promise for the rest of his life. Now, obviously, I can't diagnose Lionel Terry in retrospect, but if I were to clinically speculate, as I love to do, I'd speculate that this guy was a psychopath. He has antisocial tendencies, and when I say antisocial, I don't mean that he wanted to be away from people. That's really a misnomer when people use antisocial that way. Think of antisocial as doing things against the good of others, like pro-social is doing things for the good of others. He was superficially charming, callous, disregarded the feelings of others, and worked for his own benefit. Those are all signs of antisocial personality traits. He was also narcissistic and grandiose in his beliefs about himself. These types of patients tend to win over even the most observant clinician. They're manipulative and sneaky and often get special privileges, which is exactly what happened for Lionel Terry. Truby King took a particular interest in him and his pathology, so Dr. King frequently invited him to his home for meals and a game of cards. Frank Tod says, quote, Terry from then on was treated in a somewhat lordly fashion at the hospital. As well as having his own suite in the main building, his meals were specially prepared under his own directions. He invariably had an attendant at his disposal whom he looked upon as his servant. If the attendant was not satisfactory, Terry would have no hesitation in demanding a man more suitable to his wants. On the slopes of Mount Charlotte, beyond the Seacliff village, Terry occupied an extensive area of land which he cultivated and gardened. He constructed a very beautiful pergola, which for years was one of the main attractions of the district. For over 30 years, Lionel Terry was a familiar figure on the roads around Seacliff. Sometimes he would walk as far as Caritane or Merton. He dressed in white, had long white hair reaching to his shoulders and a neatly trimmed beard. He was usually accompanied by his pets, some goats and sheep. He would readily converse on day-to-day subjects and always gave the impression of being a highly cultured gentleman. He would frequently visit local farmsteads, presenting the children with a bag of nuts or strawberries. Perhaps he would present the housewife with a posy of flowers, neatly arranged and a product of his own garden. At times, the gift would be an illustrated verse or even a small oil painting." End quote. To say he was rehabilitated would be a stretch, but he was at least contained. His poetry continued to be overtly racist at times, and he saw himself as a godlike figure. And why not? He was treated like royalty at the hospital. It's no wonder he didn't want to leave. There isn't much else about Terry's hospitalization. Presumably, except for one incident, the remainder of his years were quiet. But in 1940, he assaulted a doctor who was trying to administer a typhoid vaccine, and he was moved to solitary confinement. Lionel Terry had a stroke and died at Seacliff Mental Hospital on August 20th, 1952. He was 79 years old. And that's the story of Lionel Terry. All in all, not a great guy. By all accounts, he seemed to be a gifted artist and writer, so it's too bad he couldn't have used those talents for good. Like I mentioned, I'm not going to read his problematic poems, but I will read just a couple of short poems that he wrote about his life and garden. This one is called The Sweetness of Nature. Oh, sweet is the music that ripples and trills from the heart of the linnet in May, and sweet is the scent of the dew-spangled rose at the dawn of a midsummer day. So it's kind of short and sweet. Here's one called The Peaceful Countryside that captures his disdain for the city. There is a peace among the mountains where the crystal waters flow. There is pleasure in the valleys where the verdant pastures grow. But the dwellers in the city neither peace nor pleasure know, for the city is the breeding place of infamy and woe. So that's Lionel Terry. Moving on. If you'd like to read more about Joe Kum Young and the challenges faced by Chinese immigrants in New Zealand around that time, there was a book of poems written in 2014 by Wellington poet Chris Say. The book is called How to Be Dead in a Year of Snakes, so check it out. As always, thank you so much for listening. I really, really, really appreciate it. If you haven't yet rated and reviewed on Apple Podcasts, I encourage you to go do that now. It helps new people find the show. Be sure to check out the Patreon page for additional content. You can access that starting at just $5 a month. But as always, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.